the Bhagavata Saptaha, the 7-day recitation of the Bhagavata by 108 Brahmin priests. There you have, right? The Brahmanas, in a sense of Brahmanization. And in the sacralized geography of an entire terrain. Thank you.
There were 2 Bhagavatas when he started doing his research, and I thought he said that one of them is from 1937. But he was saying that it's a translation, so I guess it's not this one. All right, here we go. Janmadyasya yatom vayati taratascharte shvaviya swarat tene brahma vidaya adikavaye muhyantiya suraya. I'm speaking with Barbara Holdrege, Professor Barbara Holdrege of the University of California, Santa Barbara. She is teaching religious studies in the Religious Studies Department since many years, specializing in South Asian religions, and especially Hinduism. Barbara, you've been reading, you've been teaching the Bhagavata Purana for some years, I believe. What is it about this text, the Bhagavata Purana, which is certainly at least 1,000 years old, that makes it so special? And what is it that makes it interesting for people of today? Can you say something about this?
Sure. Okay. Yes, I personally have had a close relationship to the Bhagavata Purana in my scholarship, starting even in my doctoral work. People think of me as doing, my early work as doing Vedic traditions, which I still do that. But I always had an abiding interest in Bhakti traditions, Krishna Bhakti, or more specifically Krishna Bhakti, and the Bhagavata Purana. So we can come back to that in terms of my own scholarly interests in the text. But one of the things, I teach a course every year on the gods and goddesses of India at the University of California, Santa Barbara. It's a large lower division course with 150 students.
Oh my.
I limit it. And there are 100 on the wait list.
Wow.
But I talk about the different deities. I deal with Shiva and different deities related to Shiva. Then I deal with Vaishnava tradition, specifically Krishna, because I've done so much work on Krishna. Then I deal with goddesses. But it's fascinating to me to see how much these students love Krishna. They love the other deities too, but in terms of just the interest. And I think, we just shifting to India, this is in the United States, and these are not, there are some students of South Asian traditions in my class, but the majority of them are European Americans who were science majors, and they just took my class. But there's something about Krishna that really attracts them. And I think, Krishna historically, and in contemporary times certainly, is one of the most beloved and captivating deities in the Hindu traditions, and his divine exploits have been celebrated in devotional poetry, in the scriptures, and theological doctrines, visual arts, pilgrimage traditions, dramatic performances, and a whole variety of religious culture forms that have kept this text, which is a Sanskrit text, alive among the general populace in India. And I'm even here in Tamil Nadu, I've mentioned to people that I was going to a conference on the Bhagavata Purana, and they say, what? They don't know. They say, you mean Bhagavan? I said, no, Bhagavata Purana, then I explain Puranas. Some of them know Puranas generally, that this is Bhagavata. And then I say Krishna, and they say, oh yes, stories about Krishna. They understand that.
Yeah.
They don't know necessarily about the text out of which these stories come. So I think there's something, and especially of course in the 10th book, that celebrates the life of Krishna and how the Supreme Godhead, as he's celebrated in the text, descends to earth and becomes embodied on earth, appears in a human form as a divine cowherd, and unfolds his divine exploits in the land of Vraja in Sanskrit, or Braj in Hindi, in North India. There's something about this God and his playful exploits that I think people have fallen in love with. And I think there's something about the text and capturing that has kept it alive. But in order to, as a scholar, what I've also pondered is, okay, how do we get to the contemporary period where, and let's say even the 16th century, where the Bhagavata becomes a very important text in North India. If I look back as a scholar to some of the theories about how this text emerged, one dominant theory is that the text emerged in South India, actually, in the Tamil-speaking areas of South India, and that it originated in the vernacular regional devotional traditions of the Alvars, right? The popular Vaishnava poet saints who inspired an upsurge of popular devotion in the Tamil-speaking areas of South India between the 6th and the 9th century. So if we take that scholarly theory, it's more complicated than that. The question is if, in fact, the special character of the devotion in the Bhagavata, which sets it apart from, say, the Vishnu Purana, which it appears to be modeled after as a Purana, but it has a very different quality of devotion. Many scholars have noted this. Freedom Hardy more recently has written about this in his history of devotion of Krishna in South India. But the idea that there is this more, we could say, aesthetic, passionate, ecstatic devotion that finds expression in the Bhagavata. And if you compare episodes in the Bhagavata Purana with parallel episodes in the Vishnu Purana, which is earlier, very different quality comes out, and that's this more passionate, ecstatic type of bhakti. So scholars have wanted to place that. Where do we get that? We get that, the claim is, more in South India among the Alvars. But if that devotion remained in the South, how would it have gone to North India? So there's this notion that somehow the expounders of this text, they made it a Sanskrit text. They incorporated the devotional teachings of the South Indian Tamil-speaking Alvars, along with northern Brahmanical ideologies from North India, into a single Sanskrit text that is in the form of a Purana. And that allowed it to move from South India as a kind of regional text into North India, because the Sanskritic canon is a pan-Indian canon. So I've been very interested in this process, right? How we get from 6th, 9th century, or let's say 8th to 10th century text in South India to now, especially in the 16th century in North India, where we have an explosion of Krishna devotional traditions in the north. This text becomes very central in that. And I've thought a lot about, okay, what happens there? If you look at the Bhagavata Purana itself, it's a Sanskrit text. So even though the text itself, the Bhagavata says, it's a socially inclusive text, that it's supposed to be open to people of all socioeconomic classes. And it uses a variety of different strategies, we could say, to make the text more open than, say, the Vedic text.
But it's
right?
still Sanskrit.
But it's still in Sanskrit, and that's an issue, right? So initially the Bhagavata itself says, and what I call a kind of incipient vernacularizing tendency, it says, okay, unlike the Vedic texts, which can only be heard and recited by male members of the 3 higher social classes, the Varnas, Brahmins, Kshatriyas, and Vaishyas, this text, the Bhagavata says, may be recited and heard by people at all levels of the social religious hierarchy, including women and Shudras, and those who have been excluded from hearing and reciting the Vedic text. So it's already making a move to popularize. That's first. But second, it also emphasizes not just the power of mantra, the Vedic sounds are very important, and in the Vedic tradition, it's almost the sacramental efficacy of hearing the Vedic sounds recited. The emphasis is on shabda, sound, not so much artha, meaning. And what the Bhagavad does is it shifts the emphasis from shabda to shabda and artha. So it's not just sound, but it's the meaning of the text, because there's a didactic function to this text. It sees itself as conveying important devotional teachings to the general populace. So it can't just remain in a kind of exclusionary kind of Vedic model of scripture. It has to open itself up, and it does so in the text.
It wants to get the message across to
That's
a
right.
wider audience.
That's right, that's right. And it's very beautiful how it does that. And one third thing it does, which is really interesting, is it shifts the modes of transmission. Whereas in the Vedic case, you've got exclusively oral transmission, again, by Brahmin reciters, only to be heard and recited by the male members of higher classes. Now we have a shift towards importance of both oral and written modes of transmission, which allows for the Bhagavata to then be opened up. It doesn't have to be mediated only by Brahmin priests anymore. And the text itself, as a written text, now becomes important. It becomes revered. Even in the Bhagavata Purana itself, it talks about itself as a kind of text embodiment of Krishna. Krishna embodied in the form of a concrete book. And it's supposed to be venerated as a kind of murti, a special ritual image that should be set up on a golden throne and venerated, right? So that opens up the text, because those who are illiterate and can't access the text in Sanskrit, they can at least go to the temples and venerate the text in its written form. So really important things happen within the text, but it's still a Sanskrit text. And what's interested me is, so how did it become more vernacularized? How did it move out of the Vedicizing, Sanskritizing moves that we found earlier in the text? How did it become a text that's enacted and engaged in all these ways by people everywhere in India? And that, I think, some of the crucial moments are in the 16th century. And one of the crucial moments, in my own research anyway, I've emphasized, is 16th century in Braj, the area of North India where Krishna is said to have descended and lived his life on earth. Two of the leaders of the main Vaishnava Sampradayas, Chaitanya, the founder of the Gaudiya school, as you know, and Vallabha, the founder of the Vallabha Sampradaya, the Pushti Marga, they separately go to Braj and perform pilgrimages. And they then direct their followers separately to please go to Braj and rediscover the lost Leela Stalas, the sites of Krishna's playful exploits, because even though the text itself, they believe actually was much older than scholars would say, the sites where Krishna played had been lost sight of. Where did he steal the garments of the gopis, the cow maidens of Braj? Right? Where did he subdue the serpent Kaliya in the Yamuna River? These sites, everyone believes that worships Krishna, that he literally left his imprint on the land. His footprints, they say, are there. His bodily traces are there, marking his exploits. But it took great sages of the Gaudiya and Vallabha tradition to, through the eye of knowledge, begin to see and open up and discover where these sites were. And then they established temples and shrines to mark them as tirthas, as sacred sites. So then, now we have what some have called more of a mythic space of Braj, which was enshrined in the Bhagavata as a text that celebrates Krishna's exploits, but more in narrative form. Now it's a pilgrimage place, which means from the 16th century on, literally hundreds of thousands of pilgrims have come every year from all over India, from all socioeconomic classes, to celebrate Krishna, to track his footprints, to celebrate the stories that are associated with the particular locales, the Leela Stalas that they find there.
They say that now, annually, more people visit Braj than visit the Taj Mahal.
As I mentioned earlier, but to remind everyone, that Braj is supposed to be the place on earth in North India where Krishna descended, the Supreme Godhead, beyond the material world where we live. He descended, and they say approximately 3000 BCE, and he unfolded his play, his divine play on earth. He lived on earth. So Braj, the Hindi term for the Sanskrit Vraja of the scriptures, this is where Krishna unfolded his play. And so people go there now on pilgrimage to celebrate Krishna, to track his footprints at the various sites where his divine exploits are said to have taken place. And there they engage in a variety of other kinds of more popular practices, which I think have kept this text alive. I mean, in a way, we could say, I mean, this is my own thinking now, I would argue that the Bhagavata came from the popular power matrix. It came out of the general populace, the upsurge of devotion among the Alvars. But then it was Sanskritized and Vedicized. It became a Sanskrit text, so it almost kind of receded from direct access to the general populace. And now through these various vernacularizing practices, we could say, the text now has become accessible through pilgrimage traditions, through being able to go in the land of Braj and go to different temples where they sponsor recitations of the text. Bhagavata Saptaha, we've heard about in the conference, where the entire text is recited, all 12 books over 7 days. So people can hear that recited, and then there's usually a learned scholar who then explains the text in the vernacular for that audience, right? So even though the text will still be recited in Sanskrit, that's the power of the Sanskrit mantras is there, but the meaning is also important for everyone. And so there's now a vernacular tradition of Bhagavata Katha, telling the stories in the vernacular.
The third verse is the invitation. The invitation to drink the nectar of the Bhagavad. Nigama kalpataror galitam palam shukamukad amritadravasam yutam pivata bhagavatam rasamalayam muhuraho rasika bhuvi bhavuka. Yes, it's an invitation.
Drinking the nectar,
Pivata. Drink the nectar of the Bhagavad. And it's becoming more and more popular, this Bhagavata Katha. I wanted to bring this around to the subject of divine embodiment, because I know you've written extensively on this subject, especially in relation to bhakti, the principle of devotion, devotional activity. And you mentioned that Krishna appeared, or he descends into the world in this particular place, Vraja, and you mentioned this term, he becomes embodied. Can you say a bit more about that, the idea of divine embodiment and how that works in this tradition related to the Bhagavata, which is so much emphasizing visuality, the appearance of Krishna, how he looks, how beautiful he is.
That's right, that's right. In my work on the Bhagavata Purana, I've been very particularly interested, because there are different interpretive traditions. So I've been looking at what the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition says about the Bhagavata Purana's portrayal of Krishna. So if we just look there, because the text itself describes Krishna descending and so on, but it's not, I don't see it, maybe you see it differently, I don't see it theologizing so much explicitly about how does Krishna appear on earth. But the Gaudiya Vaishnavas are very concerned to say, Krishna, yes, he appeared, and they use the term appeared on earth, but that he has what I would say is an absolute form, an absolute body beyond the material world, beyond what the Advaitin tradition calls Brahman, the impersonal Brahman. That Krishna, it resides in a transcendent domain, the transcendent Vraja, where he revels eternally in his own blissful nature. So whether or not there's a world
with his friends,
with his friends,
with the cows and so on,
right? With his eternal associates, who are, who the Gaudiyas would say, the cow maidens of Vraj, the cowherd friends of Krishna, the cows, his Nanda and Yashoda, his adoptive mother and father, that these are his eternal associates who were always with him in his transcendent world. And that at a certain time, in one cycle of creation, he chose to descend, and his eternal associates descended, and he unfolded his play on earth. So his eternal associates also appeared in human form, cow maidens, cow herds, and so on, and they engaged in the play on earth. And now the Bhagavata itself is supposed to be recording this beautiful play that, from the Gaudiya perspective, is not simply a manifest play happening in an earthly context, but is a transcendent, unmanifest play that's always going on, whether or not there's a material world.
So it's a moving party. It's a movable feast.
Yes,
so to say.
yes. And it reminds me, I want to say one thing about, when I were thinking about this, I was thinking about in the Christian tradition, where you have this notion of God coming to earth and being born as among certain Christians, Jesus Christ, that he walked the earth. If you go to, I've been there, to Israel, and you go to the various sites, they say, this is where the Sermon on the Mount occurred, this is where he was born. These are the sites where Jesus walked the earth. Later, theologically, the early church fathers debated, was he fully human? Or was he fully divine? Did he lose his divinity when he became human? And of course, there's all sorts of debates among the early church fathers. But there was one group called the Gnostic Docetists who said he only appeared to be human. And even when he appeared to suffer on the cross, he only appeared to suffer because he was never fully human. And that reminds me of the Gaudiyas, because the Gaudiyas are very clear that Krishna was not born as an ordinary human being. He was never flesh and blood. He manifested his eternal form, which is the beautiful blue-black cowherd form that exists, they would say, eternally. He just manifested it on earth. And then he withdrew it from the earth. But they say he never became human. They're very clear about that. And it reminds me somewhat of the Gnostic Docetists that way.
But the Docetists were considered by the official church to be heretics.
That's right. That's right. Because finally the church declared in various, through various negotiations and different sessions that Christ was fully divine and fully human.
Yes.
And they wouldn't allow for the only appeared to be human. But it's still, the whole question of how do you define a divinity who comes to earth, what's the relationship of the divinity to humanity? And the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, very sophisticated theology, has really tackled that. And as you have debates among the great theologian Jiva Goswami, where he says, what was the form of Krishna that appeared on earth that it is his most perfect form, his essential form? And he says, is it his narakriti, his human-like form, not human, but human shape? Or is it in his thousand-armed form, the one he manifests in the Bhagavad Gita? So he says narakriti, human-like form, or a thousand-armed form, and he says no, narakriti, the human-like form is more essential. Then he says, okay, but within the human-like form, is it two-armed or four-armed? And there he says two-armed, because Krishna in his essential form, beyond the material world, beyond Brahman, is madhurya. He's pure sweetness in the form of this charming, lovely, youthful cowherd. That's what they say he really looks like at that level, and then he manifested that on earth. Yeah.
One of the Sanskrit terms for form is, of course, murti. And we find in the first book of the Bhagavata the expression mantra murti. Iti murti abhidane and mantra murtim amurtikam. And it seems to me that the Bhagavata, you mentioned before, there's a concern in the Vedic tradition, the power of mantra. And it seems the Bhagavata wants to preserve that with this idea that mantra has form, and that form is one of the forms of the divinity.
Yes.
But also, there's so many other ways the Bhagavata is demonstrating the power of speech. And one that seems to come again and again is the idea of the curse and the blessing. So at the end of the first book, the king, Parikshita, is cursed. And that becomes the beginning of the Bhagavata proper in the beginning of book 2. And I find this interesting because that then becomes, as Parikshit is preparing to shed his body, he is, in a sense, becoming transformed by sound, by the mantra murti, which is the Bhagavat. Does that sound right?
Yeah. Well, that's what's fascinating to me is in the Bhagavata itself. In my recent book that you mentioned there, I talk about different modes of embodiment of Krishna. one chapter is on the Bhagavata itself as a text embodiment, as the embodiment of Krishna, both as a concrete book but also as sound. That the entire collection of sounds of the Bhagavata is like the subtle sounds out of which Krishna's form is made. Krishna's form at a certain transcendent level is vibrating as mantras, and that collection of mantras is the sound form of Krishna. And when the Bhagavata is recited, that he becomes present in his sound form, in his mantra murti in a certain way. Mm-hmm. The written form then takes on a different, because it's more concretized. But the idea, the whole Bhagavata, there's a term used by the Gaudiyas of grantha avatara. Mm-hmm. An avatar, a descent of Krishna in the form of a text. But it's kind of, I think that's helpful, but text in what sense? Text as sound is there. Krishna at the deep, deep level, there's a level of Krishna where his body is made of sound. And one tradition, even in the Bhagavata, it says that his body is made of the sounds of the Vedic mantras. That the riches, the yajusas, the samans of the main Vedic mantras make up the body of Krishna, all right? So if you recite the Bhagavata, you're enlivening the form of Krishna, and you're enlivening all the Vedas as well. So you don't need to actually even bother with the Vedas anymore. You just recite the Bhagavata, and you have Krishna, and you have Krishna, the Krsna Veda, the Veda that is Krishna being fully enlivened through certain practices. So reciting the text is very important. Venerating the written text is very important. Reciting the names contained in the text is very important. So nama sankirtana, nama kirtana becomes important. The Bhagavata
what
has...
What means kirtana?
Kirtana is
kirtana.
Singing the nama. Nama sankirtana. Sankirtana is like the communal singing of the names of Krishna, particularly the names of Krishna, which are also contained in the Bhagavata. Jiva Goswami talks about, well, which names? Which names? And he says those that are enshrined in the Bhagavata, because the Bhagavata is this special shastra that encompasses everything, and it is the very form of Krishna. So it's only the names in that text that become important for the recitation and singing in communal context.
What are some of the other names of Krishna that it refers to?
Oh, the Bhagavata has so many names, huh? So Govinda, right? The Lord of, the protector of cows. People translate different ways. Vasudeva, who is the son of Vasudeva, right? He's born out of his father, he's a prince actually in his early, his birth, but then he, through various means, becomes transported to the area of Braja and lives his early life as a cowherd. But Vasudeva, of course, would be another very important name, and Govinda. There's so many, Narayana. You know, what happens in the Bhagavata is very interesting to me, because you have the 10th book, which focuses on the life of Krishna. Other parts of the book, some would say they're just dealing with Vishnu. They're talking about Vishnu and Vishnu Narayana, Vishnu is Vasudeva, using different names, but some scholars would say it's only in the 10th book where Krishna becomes the focal point. I'm not sure I agree with that, because I think that in the 10th book it makes it very clear that Krishna is all the names that have also been identified as Vishnu, right? And so they're celebrating this specific form. And certainly the Bhagavata in the end declares that of all the avatars, we know the Gaudiyas say that a certain section of the Bhagavata where it talks about all the descents of the Lord, all these 22 avatars in one list. It names them. Krishna's one of those names, Rama and so on. But then at the end it says, Bhagavan, Krishna is Bhagavan Swayam.
Yes.
Bhagavan himself. So the Gaudiyas would say that is the Mahavakya we heard about yesterday, the great utterance that establishes, yes, Krishna is named as one avatar, but finally he is the avatar, and he is the source of all the other avatars. He is the supreme. Vishnu is an aspect of Krishna. He is not an aspect of Vishnu, he is the supreme. And that is a very important transformation from some of the earlier Vaishnava traditions, where Vishnu is supreme. He is the source of all the avatars. Krishna is simply one. And here it's saying, no, Krishna is Bhagavan. He is the supreme. And all the other avatars come from him.
Right. May I ask, do you have a favorite episode in the Bhagavata? Perhaps two, one in the 10th book and one in one of the other books, if something comes to mind.
Well, I'll tell you, there are two aspects of the Bhagavatam on which I've worked. In my earlier work, I worked mainly on the cosmogonic sections, all the creation narratives, because I had a specialized field of emphasis when I was a graduate student on cosmogonies. And I tracked all the way from the Rig Veda Samhita to the Brahmanas, Aranikas, Upanishads, Manusmriti, Mahabharata, through certain Puranas, and culminating in the Bhagavata. Right. So to me, it all ended in the Bhagavata because it was the most elaborate. And so I would track certain seed expressions, starting with the Rig Veda creation hymns, and all the way to the Bhagavatam, and show how it's amazing that the narratives in the Bhagavata still may retain the key elements. Yeah. It's much more elaborate, it's kind of explosion. But what was interesting to me was, in the other books beyond the 10th book, all these different versions of the creation narrative. And I always thought, what do I do with that? How do I make sense of the relationship? And then when I started working on the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, I was delighted to see how first Rupa Goswamin in the Laghu Bhagavatamrita, and then Krishnadas Kaviraja in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, building on Rupa, laid out a whole taxonomy, explaining the interrelationships among all these different manifestations of Krishna, all the different kinds of avatars, his vilasas, his prakashas, very elaborate classification system.
Which you have charted out graphically.
Which I've charted out graphically in my book, yeah. But what's fascinating to me was I realized they are really true to the Bhagavatam itself. Because I was very familiar with these narratives, I thought, okay, now this section is dealing with the avatars in the Manvantaras, the periods of Manu. And these particular avatars are in the yugas, so they're called yuga avatars. So what the Gaudiyas are doing is giving names and classifying what's already in the Bhagavata, but that helped me to see relationships that I hadn't seen before. You know, before I was like, I didn't see how to connect them all. So to me, what I was struck by there was how the Gaudiyas are so true to the text. I mean, they do take very seriously the text that is their base and that they consider to be the authoritative text in terms of looking at the cosmogonic parts and the avatars and the vilasas. So I would say, and that's those cosmogonies, those creation narratives run throughout different books. The other part that's really dear to my heart is the Rasa Leela section of the Bhagavata. 10th
the story
book.
of Krishna's dance.
Right. The story of Krishna's love play, dance with the gopis, with the cowmaidens of Braj. Chapters 29 to 33 of book 10. I was saying to you earlier that I'm teaching, actually when I go back to the United States today, I will be teaching, no, not this year, but next year I'll be teaching a seminar on devotional traditions. And the Sanskrit text that I teach in my advanced Sanskrit class is that Rasa Leela section of the Bhagavata Purana. It's such a beautiful text. It's exquisite in terms of Sanskrit. Very complex grammatical forms. Some Vedic grammatical forms are there. Beautiful kavya, beautiful poetry. And just the flavors of devotion that unfold in that section of the Rasa Leela. So I would say those are my two main, loves. I mean, I love the whole story of Krishna's life, of course, but the Rasa Leela has been my focal point, I would say.
To go back to the cursed king, a darker subject, and yet that's what, in a sense, is considered the prompting of the speaking of the Bhagavata. As I said, he's preparing to shed his body, and we have the observation that from one scholar, Rick Jarreau, that the Bhagavata can be read as a teaching on how to die. He calls it Tales for the Dying.
Yeah.
So there are quite many stories of death in the Bhagavata, but there are also many stories of birth, including, it seems to me, the story of creation. is
Yes.
really a birth story.
Yes.
And that perhaps has been neglected as a birth story. But it seems that there's a linearity in the Bhagavata at the same time as a cyclical structure. The linearity is the preparation of this king for his final demise. So could you say something about him and in reference to those who are hearing the Bhagavata, is it meant as a preparation for oneself to face the end of life? What is going on there? Is that a possible value of the Bhagavata in the present day?
Well, one thing that I was interested in my work, chapter 2 of my book, where I deal with Bhagavata itself and how the Bhagavata is represented by itself, as well as in the later Gaudiya tradition. I was interested in the way in which the Bhagavata talks about the fruits of reciting and hearing and meditating on the text, right? And one of the things that, again, different ways of dealing with text. So hearing it recited, reciting it if one has the ability to do that directly, and meditating on it. Meditation is also very important there. And one of the things I remember mapping out and thinking about was what is the fruit of reciting, hearing, and meditating on this text. And one of the things it says is that thereby one will be purified of all sin, and that one will be freed from suffering, and then one will cross the ocean of samsara. And a few verses talk about samsara meaning, the cycle of birth and death. One will cross over the ocean of samsara, the cycle of birth and death, and be liberated. So the text definitely, I don't see it as just preparation for death. I see it as preparation for going beyond death, right? As being liberated from death, but not just that. There are a few verses, not a lot, that talk about ultimately the goal would be to attain union with Krishna in his transcendent abode. There's just a few verses. Of course, the Gaudiya tradition picks up on that. But for me...
But union in a special sense.
Right. Being able to go and be with him.
Not losing one's identity.
That's right. Not losing one's identity. To be able to be with him. And, there's a couple references to how the gopis attained. Some gopis attained the ability to go and be with Krishna. The gopis that were not his eternal associates already, that they were able to...
Gopis being?
The gopis, cow maidens of Braj, that they had the ability, those who were totally devoted. The cow maidens of Braj in the Bhagavata become the models for the lover-beloved type of relationship to Krishna. They are cow maidens who, in some cases, are said to be married to other men, but they're completely and utterly devoted to Krishna. So even though they may be at home serving their husband's food or nursing their babies or cooking at the fire, when they hear the sound of Krishna's flute, they will drop everything and run to be with him and to engage in the dance, the Rasa Lila, which is the circle dance in which they engage. And that's considered to be the kind of emblem of the blissful relationship with the divine. Now, the one thing the Bhagavata clearly says, though, is yes, the cow maidens, they are an exemplar of a kind of viraha bhakti, that they yearn for Krishna when they're separate from him. They also yearn to be united with him, but even though they're married to other men, it is not a model for adultery, that they are a model of perfect devotees. Because if God calls and we're engaged in worldly life, we're supposed to be able to drop everything and go and be with him. And so in that sense, the Bhagavata is very clear. Let's not take this as a model for committing adultery, that the gopis are the models of the most perfect, consummate devotion. And what's interesting there is, going back to this idea of death and liberation, there are places in the Bhagavatam where it says that there's one gopi particularly a couple gopis, but one gopi in particular I think of, who couldn't go to be with Krishna during the dance. So she sat at home and she meditated, and she envisioned him in her heart, and she meditated on Krishna. And through the agony of her separation, all of her sins were burned up, and she attained liberation. But the text is clear that that's not really the goal, because just to be liberated and absorbed in Krishna in his unmanifest, impersonal, formless state is not the goal. The goal is to be able to engage with him, to have a living, ongoing, eternal relationship with him. So the merging in a kind of meditative state is not the goal. So liberation, as it would be framed in certain, say, Advaita Vedanta traditions or other traditions where talk about merging with the Lord, that's not the goal. It's union, which is a relationship, eternal relationship in some kind. And the gopis, there are a few references to them attaining that a relationship. So I guess I tend to be, when I think of, yes, death is there, but it's also about how to go beyond death.
Right.
And what's the final goal. And it's not just liberation, it's really having that ability to revel eternally in the blissful presence of Krishna.
Prema pumarto mahan.
Yes.
The goal of love.
The goal of love.
Love for the Supreme. Well, we could go on and on talking about this wonderful book, the Bhagavata Purana, but I think we'll...
Could I add one thing?
Oh, yes, please.
So one thing I wanted to say is we have the theory from scholars about the Bhagavata coming from maybe the devotional traditions of the Alvars in South India and then being made into the content and being made into a Sanskrit text that then went north and became a very popular text. I also want to mention just briefly what the Bhagavata itself says about it has different origins, but one story about its origins, which is about Veda Vyasa. Vyasa is considered one of the greatest seers of the tradition, as you know. He's a Maharshi, he's a great rishi, a great seer. He is said to have divya chakshus, he has divine vision. He is supposed to have known the past, present, and future. He's one of the great sages. And in the Bhagavatam, it says that he had accomplished all these literary feats. He had divided the one Veda, which was originally a singular text, 100,000 verses, into 4 sections, became the 4 samhitas. He composed the Mahabharata, the great epic. He composed the 17 other Puranas. He had attained Brahman. He was supposed to have realized Brahman, which was considered one of the highest realizations. But he wasn't fulfilled. He wasn't satisfied. And so, according to the narrative in the Bhagavata itself, it says, the celestial sage, Narada, came to him and said, you should sing the glories of Krishna. And he told him to go to his hermitage and to meditate. And so he went to his hermitage, his ashrama, and he sat and he collected his mind in samadhi, in the meditative state of samadhi. And there it says, purified by bhakti yoga, his mind purified by bhakti yoga, he saw the primordial Purusha.
The original person.
The primordial Purusha, right. And Purusha is understood here then and elaborated in the commentaries as Krishna. So what's interesting there is you have this idea that this great sage, one of the greatest of all sages, greatest of all seers, having realized so much, accomplished so much, he wasn't fulfilled until he meditated and saw the primordial Purusha in the form of Krishna. And then, according to the traditional understanding, the whole Bhagavata Purana is simply the unfoldment of the cognition, the visions of Vyasa. That the text is a record of his direct cognitions of Krishna, his divine leela or play beyond the material world, that he immersed himself in, was swinging in the bliss of Krishna, and then he came forth and recorded what he'd seen in the form of the leelas in the Bhagavatam. What's interesting there is one point the text says, so just as the Vedic seers, the Vedic rishis, took their awareness in meditation, cognized the divine, the gods, small g gods, in their realms, in their celestial regions, then they came forth and sang and recited what they'd heard in the form of hymns, preserved as hymns. The Bhagavatam is the record of the cognitions by Vyasa, the greatest of all rishis, according to this, of Krishna. And that So it's a record in the form of recited narratives, as opposed to the recited mantras or hymns of the Rig Veda. But what that leads to then finally is the notion that as long as one recites this text, one has the benefit of all the Vedic mantras, because Krishna is the text, it's a cognition of the text. It's not just about Krishna, but it is Krishna. But it all goes, for me, it all goes back to that claim about the direct experience of Vyasa in meditation. And that's why I think later in the text it talks about the importance of also meditation as one means of realizing Krishna beyond reciting and hearing and chanting names and so on. So.
I like your expression, swinging in the bliss of Krishna. Very nice. Thank you.
Thank you
So much.
Yes, great joy.